Go ahead.
I think Taifan wanted to talk first. He has been having his finger.
Yeah, just it's not so relevant anymore. But essentially, one of the things that you're seeing from the demographics, it goes back to earlier on. Toby was saying that when people are hungry, they're going to be in the streets, and I think that as almost a warning of like you're going to get these kind of riots when people are hungry. And I think that there's a really strange thing where it's almost as if they're going to create these riots and create this sort of instability, and then we're going to have, and they're basically destabilizing themselves with the riots on the front end and then the difficulty on the back end. And it's not simply just like, in the US, we're seeing that destabilization where like riots lead to a situation where people are going to be moving out of big cities, then big cities' tax bases drop, and all of a sudden there's no money to pay for all those services, kind of like what Mehdi was mentioning of, you've got tons of people who have a need, and the middle class who's paying to kind of support it with their taxes leaves, and now the thing collapses. And what you're seeing in Europe, like if people go back to the 2019 UK elections, one of the big things that they were talking about was how the NHS was really buckling under the weight of having brought in so many people who weren't, paying to contribute to that tax base. Yet we're demanding resources, or we're needing resources, and they would treat people regardless of their status, just so long as they appeared in the hospitals. And the last time I was in France, it was like my mother-in-law was telling me that she was really lucky to get a dentist appointment, and I asked her why. It sounded kind of strange. Like they're not in a small town. I've heard 5-10 years ago that small towns don't have dentists, but now it's gotten to a point over there where like dentists, doctors, they're so stressed that you can live in like the equivalent of a suburb of Seattle over in France. And like people don't want to take on that job because the government is kind of defining what your pay is based off of the benefits that they have to give out. And ultimately there's so much stress. Yeah, there's so much stress on exactly. There's so much stress on them that they drop out of it, and the system starts to deteriorate. Those benefits that people were expecting back in the day are no longer there for them. And I think that that's something that's very, very interesting about the point where we are right now, where part of, at the beginning, Waqar had mentioned this sort of activity that, say, like neocons or like US military interest do in other countries and potentially destabilize other regions, have people kind of migrate and leave. End up in Europe, and then the benefit systems end up getting destabilized, and those countries are destabilized. Not even if we take away any sort of riots and violence and that sort of thing, just the simple math of bringing in a bunch of people who are maybe net negative contributors to the tax base, essentially taking out more government services than they're actually paying for, because often you have people who they're not speaking French and they're migrated to France, or they don't really have any necessary skills, so it takes some time in order to level up. So yeah, ultimately that's all I wanted to jump in and say, that the demographic changes that have been kind of not simply from an aging population, but also from destabilization in other places, people flooding in or taking the opportunity to flood in, and then how that puts a stress on their social benefit systems, and that essentially leads towards that situation that that Toby was mentioning. Like at the very beginning, I'd mentioned that when they were trying to subsidize the energy increases that are a result of like the Ukraine war, then that creates more stress on their accounts. As I understand it, I imagine that would have been something that went into consideration for the retirement age delay, and then you get protests and riots after that age delay. So all of these things are kind of coming together and destabilizing the system.